Good evening and welcome to Seasons of Play. This is this year's Green College Leading Scholar cohort series on critical play. My name's Emma Cunliffe. I'm the principal here at Green College. And I'd like to begin the session in a good way by acknowledging that we're gathering and knitting and learning today on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And for those of you who know a little bit of the local history of this place, this has always been a place for gathering, for learning, and for exchange of ideas. And we at Green College, at UBC, owe a great debt of reconciliation to the Musqueam people whose land this was and remains. And I think that's a thread that runs through Seasons of Play in many ways, the acknowledgement of place and of responsibility that comes with place. So I'm very grateful to the leading scholars for organising a wonderful series for us today, including this evening's event. And I'm going to hand over to Alex Tavasoli, who's going to introduce our speakers and the format for this evening.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Alex Tavasoli. Thanks, Emma. And I'm an assistant professor in the mechanical engineering department at UBC here. And you might be wondering what the connection is between mechanical engineering and knitting here today. I run a research group called the Laboratory of Future Industry. The acronym is LOFI, and we study low fidelity ways of bringing back productive industries to the community level. And really what that tries to do is localize what have become industrial production processes and understand the ways that that creates community resilience and just a more sustainable future in general. And that's connected to the idea of craft because we used to make a lot of the stuff that we buy at the store now at the household level. Like my great-grandmother in Portugal had this crazy 2-barrel system at her house where she would dump wood ash in the top from her wood stove, and then it would rain down on these barrels and it would leach out alkaline solution from the wood ash, and then she would use that to make soap using waste fat from her cooking. And a couple generations later, nobody really knows how to do that. And that's like a traditional industrial household process that has kind of left our traditional knowledge. And craft has a lot to do with that because those industrial crafts that have left our house have sort of separated us from being able to control the industrial systems, and we have very little autonomy over their centralization and the fact that they operate in very polluting ways. So the connection we wanted to draw here today is that by engaging in craft yourself and learning how to make things in your own home and with your own hands is really a way of taking back that power and localizing that industry again. You might not think of it as industry. I'm certainly not thinking about it when I'm watching TV and knitting at night. But the reason we decided to call this session Crafty Play is that there is that subversive nature of what you're engaging in when you participate in making stuff. So that's what I wanted to introduce the panel. I'm going to let Jermaine introduce the first speakers. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. This was a great turnout. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're afraid that this is going to be the presentation where nobody's going to be looking at the screens and people are going to be looking at their knitting instead. But let's encourage you to pay attention to the presentations as well. So my name's Jermaine Coe, and I'm also an assistant professor, me in the visual art department, although Alex and I have started collaborating, and that has been because our practices intersect on this question of making, of DIY make and community-based making. And so my function in the visual art department, or my self-appointed function, is to teach these visual artists hand skills, how to make stuff, and the recurrent messaging in my class is that is that by learning how to make things and how the world actually works, there's a real power in that. So we've brought together, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight, who are all Vancouver-based artists who for whom aspects of craft are part of their practice. And they use it as a means of critically engaging with the world. And by doing so, they show us how the kinds of power of making that essentially making is can be also remodeling the world, right? So that's the kind of I don't know, aspirational, I guess, question that we have out here today. So our speakers in order are going to be doing about 15 to 17-minute presentations. I'll do the timekeeping. So first, we're going to have Lorna Brown. So Lorna is someone who interweaves art making, curatorial practice, and writing. Until recently, she was the acting director / curator at the Belkin Art Gallery, which is just up the hill from here. She has a long history with artist-run organizations, which in themselves are expressions of the power of community to organize. So that includes being the director, curator of Art Speak Gallery and a founding member of Other Sites for Artists organization, which is an organization that is dedicated to bringing critical propositions out into public space. She's taught at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, where she's also received an honorary doctorate in 2015. And she's also taught at Simon Fraser University, where most recently she also has a new commission in the inaugural exhibition of the new Gibson Art Museum. So next after Lorna will be Garnet Hertz. Garnet Hertz is Associate Professor of Design at Emily Carr University, where he was also previously Canada Research Chair in Design and Media Arts. Previously, he's been faculty at Art Center College of Design and a research scientist at UC Irvine, University of California, Irvine. His art and research investigates DIY culture, electronic art, and design. And that includes his recent book, Art and DIY Electronics, which I hope you'll touch on. And though I will also mention and hope that he might touch on his more DIY publishing, including zines, which I know is a recent thing, right? So Garnet has shown his work at festivals, at big international art festivals, including SIGGRAPH and Ars Electronica, and won international awards, including the Oscar Signorini Award and a Fulbright Award. And then we're going to round off our speakers with Christian Huizenga, who's an interdisciplinary artist, an architect, and filmmaker, who primarily works in sculpture, meticulously crafted sculpture, I will add, as well as large-scale public installations. So locally, you'll find those at King George Hub in Surrey, as well as most recently the Giving Tree over. No, that's at King George, as well as the Wake Pavilion on the Richmond waterfront. So go and check those out. His practice engages with ideas of citizen-initiated architecture and craft, and blending the built environment with the natural environment. He has a design studio called Huizenga Studio, and has founded an initiative I hope he will talk about called the School of Direct Experience, which is a kind of design, build, craft, and architecture school. And he also works collectively with his family under the name the Zenga Brothers. So we'll pass off.
Thanks very much for coming and for the introduction. Really happy to be here. Really happy to learn about you guys' work. It looks amazing. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few pieces, and thanks, Jermaine, for timekeeping. Appreciate that. I do sometimes work in embroidery, and my interest in embroidery is has to do with the fact that in early Western art, it was equivalent in importance to what history painting was later on. For instance, the commemoration of historical events or religious themes. So looking at something like the Bayeux Tapestry, it's just one example of a rich history of storytelling through needlework. And many famous tapestries document stories of displacement and war. And much of our understanding of the myths of the ancient world comes from the stories told in textiles. So that was sort of one thread of interest in using embroidery. It also has a relationship to text just within the word, text and textile, coming through Latin term. And it was usually and is usually performed by women, usually anonymously, either as a decorative practice or as devotional. In the example of these large-scale tapestries, for instance. Although, I mean, you know, as recently as the 70s, women in refugee camps during the Vietnam War created story cloths to chronicle their experiences. And so I'm interested in that relationship and role that it plays in social history. It has also a really interesting relationship to time. It's, come on, back. It's time consuming, and but it can also be executed in small snippets of available time, which is certainly like how I do it. Historically, for a leisure class, it was a way to pass the time. And I was interested in what you were talking about in terms of the early industrial era, that it was one of the few places where women could access paid labor. So this piece is called Time Bomb, and it's one of many small pieces that I've done in hand embroidery to kind of commemorate things that are either obsolete or at this kind of funny point of obsolescence. Time Bomb, it commemorates two of the early icons created by Susan Ware, who is a young sculptor hired by Apple in the early 1980s to create graphics and fonts for the first kind of rollout. If you're old enough, you'll recognize the Time Bomb she credits learning needlepoint embroidery from her mother as the visual framework for the development of a suite of these now legendary icons and fonts that were named after cities such as Chicago, Geneva, Monaco, and New York. It's also interesting to me because it's one of the series of works exploring the transitional space between analog and digital representation. And I'm continue to be interested in technologies and methods that are becoming obsolete during my lifetime. So it's also a way of tracking my time here. And it fits in a larger sense in my practice to the relationship of abstraction, diagrammatic representation, architecture, and bodily experience that can be found in works that use old and new technologies. This is a piece called Carrots, Strikeouts, Underlined Circles, and Dots. It's a series of tiny oil paintings that commemorate the red pen marks that are previously used to edit text by hand. The edit marks form notation system that most copy editing is now completed using track changes functions of word processing software. So working from a scan of handwritten copy edit marks that I found online, I hired a sign painter, which is also another almost obsolete process, to create these for me, to interpret the marks in a series of 48 paintings on wood. And So by making them oil paintings, although tiny, it sort of elevates their status, their sort of provisional status as an invisible part of the publication process, and speaks to the history of things I'm also interested, like printers, ornaments, and the margin notes of the scribe and the rubricator. This work is called Listening Time, 460 hours, 31 minutes, and it's one of many, many artworks that I've made about the phenomenon of boredom that include video installations, wallpapered rooms, a whole range of things. You probably all know what the QR code is, but just a little bit of a backstory to it. It's abbreviated from Quick Response Code, and it's the trademark for a type of matrix barcode first designed for Japanese automotive industry. The QR code system has become popular due to its fast readability and greater storage capacity compared to standard UPC barcodes. So initially used for product tracking, item identification, time tracking, document management, and so forth, QR codes are pretty ubiquitous in marketing and promotional materials. Consists of color modules arranged in a square grid on a white background, which can be read by imaging device such as a camera. The required data are then extracted from patterns present in both horizontal and vertical components of the image. The importance of this capability is that it increases the conversion rate, the chance that contact with the advertisement will convert to a sale, by coaxing interested prospects further down the conversion funnel with little delay or effort, bringing the viewer to the advertiser's website immediately. While QR codes are expanding in a range of applications, including being added to tombstones, where the code leads to a virtual gravesite of the deceased, their novelty for consumers is leveling off. This is what I thought. And I wrote this like pre-2020. During the pandemic, I think their usage became much more, it jumped over, leapfrogged over its obsolescence because of people not wanting to use touch menus and things like that. So this QR code, when you scan it, goes just to the word boring. And hand embroidered over the course of several months, the title refers to the hours I spent listening to audio content during the same time period while I was embroidering, as recorded by a podcast compilation app called Stitcher. One of the things, so this relationship to time is that it slows down this process of reading or understanding. It introduces friction, which is something that I'm really interested in doing in my art practice, to disrupt the seamlessness of contemporary culture generally and digital culture in particular. So using a simple cross stitch, which is not a high skill embroidery, to create the grid-based pattern, it removes all decision-making in the execution of the work beyond the initial concept, requiring me to perform this repetitive, time-consuming action in a completely predictable system. Interestingly, though, those are the characteristics of the experience of boredom. So taking that experience and turning it into art was an interesting prospect to me. And it's also interesting because art, its production and its reception, relies on the preconditions of boredom, the relative material security that's required, and the sufficient time to create or consume art. So boredom enters the English language about 1850. Catastrophe enters English about 1540. And I've been working on these two concepts together for some time. So this is Listing Time Unknown. It was produced a few years after the companion piece. By that time, the Stitcher app was obsolete. And so I was listening on Overcast, which is also a textile term. Overcast doesn't offer the same time tracking function of Stitcher, so I lost track of the hours I spent listening. And increasingly over those years, the reportage and analysis became much more politically and much more about political and climate calamities as I was embroidering. But I have been thinking about catastrophe for about as long as boredom. Catastrophe. Strophe is from the Greek. It's a sudden turn. So, for instance, an apostrophe changes a word to indicate possession. Catastrophe is like a reversal of what is expected or overturn. And it has its origin in Greek theater, where the chorus would cross the stage from left to right, reciting one side of an argument, and then it would turn and it would walk the other way, recite the opposite point of view, the antistrophe. So based on, I was also looking online at these math models, and like I don't know anything about math, so it's funny, these like graphics start to take on a different kind of sensibility when you really don't know what you're looking at. This is a swallowtail catastrophe, and it's a risograph, which is an early form of color photocopying that's no longer really in use. But these math models explore catastrophe theory in the study of dynamical systems. So, for instance, if a particular society doesn't adopt a particular technology, it graphs out when a certain economic system would collapse. This was a killer. This was a catastrophe umbilical, and it took several years to do. It's large and really detailed. This is actually Google Analytics 2018 to 2023 catastrophe boredom. Also a larger piece. This commemorates 5 years of Google search data between 2018 and 2023. The point where boredom and catastrophe converge is 2020. I saved a PNG of this search data in 2023, but I didn't get around to doing the embroidery for about another year. It's also this slowness that handcraft requires that puts one in this state, much more contemplative state of mind, your decisions as an artist are more delayed, deferred, maybe ruminated on a little too much, I don't know. But they could also be fun. This was another umbilical catastrophe that I commissioned from a craftsman on a beach in Mexico, where you get your name done with this nylon cord. And then later, it's not a great image, it needs to be reshot, but I had a friend of mine get the companion work done when she was on vacation. So these forms and uses of abstraction also align with interests in the abstractions of property and public space. As Jermaine mentioned, I've worked for 20 years with a collective called Other Sites for Artist Projects, and we do work in public space that the mandate is to look at the regulatory, economic, social conditions of public space and public life. And so my work in the collective, in the studio, and also curatorially tend to kind of dovetail and support or interfere with one another. This is, that's the beach. This is Odd Lots after Gordon Matta Clark. Gordon Matta Clark, the New York artist who didn't live very long, but he did a lot of really remarkable work looking at architecture, built environment. But one piece in particular that I loved so much, I learned about from his archive, and this is an embroidery of his drawing of a series of very small slices of property in New York City that he purchased. And they were, some of them tiny, just little triangular pieces. The deal with this work was that he sold the artwork to a collector, and the collector's part of the bargain was to keep the taxes paid. But once the collector passed away, the taxes lapsed and the work ceased to exist. So just one more minute. Yikes, I've got to keep going. So yeah, I'm really interested in his work, but I wanted to just quickly also show this new commission for which is up at the Gibson right now. It's called easements, and easements are defined as places in the city where property relations are not completely fixed. So, for instance, it might be an area where a sign overhangs a sidewalk, where you have the owner of the sign has to get permission to do that, like hang it there. There are easements where you can drive over somebody else's property to get to yours, etc. I've always been fascinated with easements. So this is a hand drawing. All of the easements in Vancouver are pulled together and compressed into this one area. It looks a little bit like a medieval city. Drawn by hand on the wall, so it will disappear once the exhibition is complete. And then these like sofas and poofs are for places to people to sit and rest. And then the third component of the installation, they extend out into the outside as well, although they're not upholstered, they're hard. Also, there are 6 audio files that talk about or describe the easements in terms of their flora, fauna, their history. I'm just going to run through these lovely photographs from Rachel Topham. And I brought along the signage with the QR code, so if you want to click on the QR code, I'll leave it here, and that will take you through to the audio. So thanks very much.
All right, well, thanks for having me here. My name is Garnet Hertz, and I'm at Emily Carr University. I was going to give a talk today on a book project that I did a couple of years ago, and trying to define what I'm terming the DIY mindset. Now, a bit about myself. I grew up in Saskatchewan. My dad was actually a mechanical engineering professor at the U of S for 43 years. I've been in LA for quite a while, going to grad school there and organizing events. And I work in different disciplines. I have an MFA in a program called Arts Computation Engineering, did a PhD in humanities, and did a postdoc in computer science. And so I work around different disciplines. And this is the book that I released a couple years ago, and it's available for free through MIT Press. So you can access the whole book there. And so I'll go over some of it today and the stuff that I thought was pertaining to our topic. So this is the abstract of the book. I'm not going to read it or get into it too much. I'm just going to go over 3 different examples of different concepts, and I'm going to show 3 historical examples and 3 of my own examples to try to illustrate these points. And one of the main things that I have kind of going on in this aspect of my work is looking at what advantages non-experts have in designing technologies. And so I am interested in how artists use technology and how non-experts or amateurs use technology. And so what I'd like to propose for today is that we talk about 3 different terms. One is wabi-sabi, the next is burlesque, and the last is zombie technologies. So I'll go in and give a historical example for each of these, and then I'll show an example of my own. So, and in my book, I go through a whole lot of other examples. So this is just kind of a sample. So we'll do one historical example, the concept, and then my own work. So I think of this as kind of like the DIY mindset, or the idea of what's the advantage of doing something yourself? What's the advantage of an amateur using technology? And the first thing is this idea of imperfection. And I'm not an expert in Japanese philosophy or anything, but this term is absolutely amazing and great to summarize kind of a concept and a mindset. So wabi-sabi, if you look it up in the dictionary or do Google image search, you'll see a number of different things having to do with finding beauty with imperfections, observing the things that are worn. So Google image search will come up with something like this, where it's very rustic, very worn, almost tattered and dirty, non-symmetrical, slow, with an essence of time and time passing is also important to the concept. And it's represented in a lot of different ways. Wabi-sabi is a number of different things. It's not like a simple thing. And it's used, if you Google it, you also end up with a bunch of interior design images of people taking this as an interior design kind of inspiration. I'm not so much interested in that, but this writer, Leonard Cohen, split this out into 2 different categories. He kind of compared modernism on the left versus wabi-sabi on the right. So modernism is thought of as slick, well-maintained, purity. Wabi-sabi is more natural, crude, degraded, worn, old, imperfect, or ambiguous. So one thing that I thought was a nice example of a wabi-sabi approach of artists using technology, I put it on the cover of my book. This is an image of Nam June Paik, who is best known as the originator of a lot of what's now called video art. Is best known for doing a lot of video art work. But this is a robot that he built in 1964. And this thing was kind of looks like a scrap heap a little bit. It's not a perfect robot. It's actually kind of an intentionally crappy robot. And it would shuffle down the street, it would spit out beans, it would have had a record player that would record, or a tape player that would record, play audio, and it would kind of fumble around. It had breasts that would spin, and audio and fans, and it was a real kind of contraption. So, what inspiration can you get out of a crappy robot? Well, I think, or at least what I see it as, is that it's a much more temporary, and in a lot of ways, I see it as much more honest to the relationship that artists have with technology, and a lot of the ways that we as humans have to technology. It's often a struggle just to get an app installed or something on your computer or whatever. People struggle with technology. And it's actually better to look at it in comparison with stuff that were around at the same time, where you have, in Hollywood, you had this idea of kind of like this very slick, finished, modern, and nowadays you could think of it as like AI-ish on the left, and advanced technology where this is much more imperfect, repurposed, temporary, and quite junky, actually. And I think that this is okay because it has a lot of advantages. It's not for everything. You don't want your freight elevator designed in a wabi-sabi kind of way, but it's a handy approach to build work, and you can build work quickly. This is a machine that I built in 1996 that was internet-controlled drawing machine that had a video camera. It would drag around a robot that would mark on the ground. Very early kind of internet-controlled stuff, and I was just interested in the visceral kind of component of people around the world scratching their way on a cement floor. So for me, the wabi-sabi temporary kind of hacked together kludgy kind of approach was really useful, and I think the frugality of designing in this way, of kind of working in rough temporary ways can be quite productive. So wabi-sabi then can be thought of as a frugal, imperfect, and temporary kind of approach. And this isn't exactly, wabi-sabi is a lot more, and this is a bit of a bastardization of the concept, but I think it's a great idea that gives us some hints as to what the advantages of artists using technology. Next is burlesque. No, this is not going to be this is not the part where I take my shirt off or anything. So if you Google burlesque, you end up with this. And it's really interesting because the history of the term actually has to do with upper class making fun of lower class and lower class making fun of upper class. Burlesque is a form of satire that is class-based. Now, I didn't know this until I, was reading through the dictionary or whatever and came across this idea of burlesque. It's an older concept of the term that's not really in use, but I think it's interesting to think about class-based humor. So one historical project that I think is pretty great, this is from Laura Kakauka from Toronto, and she lives in Berlin. She has this project called Hairbrain 2000, and the way that it works is that there's a bunch of relays on a helmet, which is actually like a pasta strainer, and there's mirrors in front of the eyes. Here's kind of a schematic of how it works. So there are mirrors in front of the eyes, and there's a ball bearing that makes sparks in front of your eyes. So it's kind of like an analog joke on VR. It's a bit of a parody of VR that you have like a kaleidoscope spark machine in front of your eyes, and as you tip your head around, the ball moves around and it changes the sparks, and you have this shorting out kind of circuit in front of your face. And it makes this loud kind of clanking sound. And then she proceeds to, put on this outfit and kind of like try to navigate the Berlin metro. And this goes on for many, many minutes. It's a bit of an ordeal, kind of trying to go around in everyday life with a VR helmet on. I don't know if anybody's bought the new Ray-Ban Meta glasses, but it's supposedly not like this anymore. However, and so just to get into the idea of burlesque for a minute, if you dig into the concept of burlesque, there's this idea of low burlesque and high burlesque. Low burlesque is when you have a low-brow, low-culture people making fun of high culture. High burlesque is kind of high society making fun of low class. And so if you take the example of Shakespeare and The Simpsons, let's say Shakespeare is high class. Now, I'm aware that Shakespeare used to, I won't argue about it. Shakespeare, high class, The Simpsons, low class. So for example, if we take this as an example, you could say a low burlesque would be The Simpsons doing Hamlet, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So it's sort of like punching up kind of humor. A high burlesque would use Shakespearean language to do The Simpsons. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of like the highbrow, like making fun of the lowbrow, or the lowbrow kind of parodying. It's kind of like a class-based parody. So, and I think that this is kind of useful, and it shows a nice example, because a lot of amateurs and I put artists for the most part in that category, can do things as a parody. And so I think that this is actually kind of a really decent parody. And I actually think that it's still kind of relevant. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like this that is not that far from Laura Kakauka, walking around like this. And I would argue that even that Zuckerberg should have seen Hairbrain 2000. It would have saved him a lot of money. So it makes a parody. It's using low tech to make a parody of high tech. And I think that this is a valuable way that artists and amateurs can do this. Now, I don't have time to get into the complex, to the nature of this project, but this is a project that I had done from 2005 to 2007. I was very interested in robotics at the time, and I was very critical of everybody wanting to use insect models and bio-inspired robots, that I took an actual insect and I put it in control of the robot kind of as a joke, and then it turned into this kind of meme, and I've traveled around the world kind of demoing this thing. So in this project, there's an insect that sits on a ball. It looks out in front of the robot. Lights shine toward the robot from directions that there are obstacles. And then the idea is that the insect will turn into the dark. So if the robot is coming like this up to an obstacle like this, a light will shine from this perspective, and the insect doesn't like light. So it will go, oh, I want to go into the dark, and it'll turn the robot in to steer away from the thing most of the time. Although the cockroaches like driving it into expensive things and off of stairs and all sorts of stuff. It actually highlights some of the ways that being biological is actually really different than being a computer. It becomes much less predictable system, and you're at the whim of these insects. So as an idea, as a second idea, the non-experts can be used to critique high-tech with low-tech. And lastly, zombie technologies. What is zombie technologies? Well, zombie technology, I'll actually start here with a historical example. There's a group in San Francisco called Survival Research Labs that can be credited with lots of things, including inspiring the birth of Burning Man, a whole bunch of stuff that did these machine performances and they still are active today. They started in 1979, and they do these extreme machine performances that are what I think of as like very punk robotics. And this is the first machine that they had built, called the demanufacturing machine. The way that this thing works is that it takes objects and demanufactures them. So it's kind of like a object shredder that was made from components that were taken from an old brewery. So these are all repurposed devices, and it's made into kind of this like punk robotic thing that completely shreds up. It's kind of like driving a lawnmower over a kid's toy or something. So that's how it works. Now, so what is a zombie technology? Well, and I don't have time to get into this whole diagram, but there's some mention of obsolete. Your diagram? Yeah, well, this isn't all my diagram. This beginning, some of you may, and it's worth Googling what the Gartner hype cycle is. It's an idea that there's a lot of excitement around a technology when it first comes out, then it crashes. So AI right now is about at the top of that kind of bump, that first bump, and it will crash in a year or two, is what the model Gartner Group predicts. Then it takes a while for the engineering maturity to come up, which is the dashed line. The engineering maturity takes a while to figure out what the technology is for. It becomes a mass consumer commodity. And my argument is that there's a phase where things become obsolete at the end, that it's very cheap and is a good place for artists to repurpose technology or for just people to experiment around with stuff. So I see it as new media at the beginning, but then a bit of a zombie phase at the end, where things are reborn, kind of like vinyl or cassette tapes or a lot of other things. So this is an example of how the obsolete can be reinvented into new stuff. So, and not that this is some great like recycling kind of initiative or anything, but the idea is to repurpose old things into new stuff after they've sort of become obsolete. I think it's an opportunity that a lot of artists have. So this is a project that I did in 2011 that took an old obsolete arcade game that I got off of Craigslist for $300. I combined it with a golf cart, and then I made a computer vision system at the top that was like, I don't know if anybody here knows Max MSP, but is a very bad Max. It's not like a Tesla self-driving car kind of software. It's very much like a kludge artist Max MSP hack. And it looks at the road and it tries to make an 8-bit augmented reality kind of version of that. Yeah. So in conclusion, we have a number of these concepts. Wabi-sabi, burlesque, and zombie technologies, where wabi-sabi is using the imperfect, Low burlesque is a type of critique. Zombie technologies, repurposing old stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, other terms that are in my book. And that is all. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm an architect, I'm an artist, and I also run this school that I started a few years ago called the School of Direct Experience, and that's what I'm going to focus on talking today about. I'm going to refer to it as SODE. SODE is really a social practice project. I see it as my project that gets me out of the studio and into the world working with people outside of more of kind of a architecture and art-based practice. It's been developed with, it was actually my thesis project at U of T, architecture program, and then it's been developed with friends and family, and yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I see it within the context of art really as like a happening or an action, or we also call it a prototype for play. And they are projects that are community built and require often workshops and people to make them happen. So today I'm going to talk about 9 projects, ideas, and adventures. And each of these projects, some of them came before the start of SODE, but they kind of emphasize ideas that SODE likes to have or kind of work towards. And so each of them kind of has something I've learned or we've learned through doing a project that kind of is the goal of what we try to do with SODE. So I also want to say that AI was not used in the ideation or creation of any of these projects. They were all handmade by humans with love. So project number 1 is the Winking Circle. And the key thing that I learned through the Winking Circle was it comes from this do-it-yourself culture, but it really amplified do it together. And so this idea of collective building. The Winking Circle was a youth collective that my brothers Benny and Will started back in 2000, I believe. And this is me in the white clothes and the bowl cut. So I was just a kid. And so the Winking Circle was this, essentially I grew up in a very rural town where there wasn't stuff for youth to do. There was very little youth support, especially in the arts. So my brothers actually opened up their house and created a youth collective to do projects and get people out doing things. It was a very like anti-TV, anti-consumerist kind of group, and really wanted to promote just like self-expression and creative expression. And so from a young age, I grew up in a world where I believed you could create your own creative reality. I was surrounded by people who did this, and so that had a big impact on me. This is, the Winking Circle did many projects. There's a whole documentary about it. But this is one project I want to talk about called the Wink House. And it was really a good example of kind of collective action as a way to what we call accentrify the landscape. And so this was in a very suburban area where there was hundreds of houses that all looked like this. But we, through cutting up mostly waste material, we created and added color and personality to this home. And so you can see these are all pop cans. But it required many hands to do it. You can see other elements of the house, a nod to Picasso above the garage doors, these creative bikes. And then, yeah, it was really an art installation to kind of contrast what we're used to seeing in really consumer sort of aesthetics. Our homes, our bikes, our cars are often off the shelf and we don't do too much to them. And so seeing this at a young age of being like, oh, you can really create your own creative reality, especially if you have people to help you do it. The second project is a project that we call Joy Machines. And the kind of learning from it is that creative objects can really invite cross-cultural contact and collaboration. And a few ways that I've learned that it does it is if for us, a joy machine, it often starts with a very familiar object, which is, in this case, a bicycle. And you can see it's just something that we all know. But through transforming it kind of slightly, making it grow, making it taller, it turns a regular object into something that's quite kind of extraordinary, but you're almost kind of confused by it because it's still rideable. But the familiarity, for me, actually, is the thing that I found is the great kind of connection between people. People come up to you because they're like, oh, it's a bike, but something weird has happened to it. Another aspect of these joy machines are that they're often handmade out of kind of like used materials. So it has a very like familiar or an accessible way of making. They're often welded together with cheap welders, especially when we started out, and just made out of scrap bicycles. This was made out of actually a bed frame. And so that's another aspect, is making things that people can relate to and be like, oh, could I build my own? And you'd be like, yeah, you actually could. They're also very playful and inviting. We've ridden them all over the place, and it's very common that people will ask to ride them out of the blue. And we have good techniques for getting people up on them. And it's artwork that, rather than just viewing, you can actually try out yourself and get the full experience from it. We've done large trips with them. This is a trip that we did with my family called the Eccentrification Tour back in 2011. And then this specific bike was one I learned a lot from. We called it the Tall Horse, and my brother Ben and I rode it from Cairo to Cape Town. And we were riding regular bikes, and partway through in Ethiopia, we decided to join them, kind of just as like, we do this sort of stuff. We're going to do it for a few days. But it became the most amazing way to interact and connect with local peoples and villages we went through, because we would show up in these villages, people would run out onto the streets, and it's like we didn't exist. It was like, what's this bike? And it was such an amazing way. It was no longer like, oh, there's these foreigners coming through our town. They're like, what's this weird bike? Can we try it? And people would take off on it and ride around for a while and come back. And it was just like a pretty incredible experience of the power that objects can have as a way of kind of communication and breaking down barriers. And I try to continue that on. And what I make now, this was in 2008. I was 18 here. A third project, this was one that came out of my doing an undergraduate at Emily Carr, and it's called the Graffiti Living Studio, and the concept was really practicing plein air architecture. A lot of architects and designers work in these environments that are cut off from the world often, and the clients and spaces that they're working for, but they still require focused space. And so I wanted to play with this idea, could you make kind of a little aperture studio that you could place around the city to contemplate an environment that you're designing for. And so this very much is like you're separated. There's no ladder or anything to it. And it's really just function as like this micro studio as an aperture to really contemplate the environment that you're sort of tasked to work with. Just a totally handmade thing, kind of an experimental approach to this idea of plein air architecture. Another project that I also did when I was at Emily Carr as a student, I called the Studio Outsider, and the goal was like, as artists, we often work also in these very in private spaces, and I was like, oh, if I was forced to bring my practice outside, what would that look like? And I was curious to see. So it's called the Studio Outsider. A lot of my work is inspired by outsider artists, but this is a play on words where it's like I'm taking the studio, and outsider artists often work in totally remote and are sometimes not discovered until they pass away, where this is like, I want to make the studio and make it an outsider in the public realm. So it was this very handmade, relatively quickly made thing that represented a lot of the key aspects of my creative process at the time. I had inspiring books, a little library, fold-out table, a whole variety of tools that I had at the time. Tea is a very crucial part to my creative process. And then also at the time, specifically, skateboarding was a really big part of my process. It's essentially like my form of meditation and yoga kind of combined. It's like a break from what you're working on, and then you get back into work. And ultimately, it's mobile, and you could bring it around to different spaces. I did it a few different versions. This was one where I actually added a little, like, just a fire cook stove to it, so you could make food and tea and kind of create a bit more of a reason for people to come beyond just me working there. Yeah, you can see it there. Number 5, the rail ramp. Another concept that we really try to approach with the School of Direct Experience is citizen-initiated architecture. And so the idea is you see with DIY skate parks or community gardens are one of the few forms where people can really be involved in making a space. And I took those ideas and wanted to create a community-built space that used an unused public space. So this was on the Olympic line that was put in for the Olympics, then was no longer used after. And it's quite a beautiful corridor that essentially people only walk dogs down. And so I was like, why not use this existing foundation and build a space mostly out of waste material with a group of people. We didn't have permission, and it lasted there for quite a few weeks. And it was interesting passing by. It was my route to go to school, and I would just see how different people kind of took it on. And a key part about it was really that it also required a group of people to move. It was different than having a small studio space, but it required collective action to kind of like make it function. Okay, lounge ramps. This is another thing I was curious to explore, is the idea of collective creation as community ownership in the same way that like community gardens do that. I was asked to do an installation for the Audain Art Museum, and I really wanted to make an artwork that some of the community helped build and then ended up in the gallery, so that they would bring their families to the gallery and be like, hey, I made that. Like, how many people get this opportunity to go to a museum and say, I made that? And so I wanted to expand it upon me being there, but bring this group of kids into it as well. And it was a skateboard-centric show, and I had overheard they needed some chairs for the exhibition was full, but I heard they needed some chairs to read the catalog from, and I was like, oh, I'll make the chairs, but with a group of kids. And then that kind of tied it all in. But it was a really beautiful and quick exercise. It was really just an afternoon, but we did like welding. We used all sorts of tools. We had them assemble these ramps all together, and then ultimately they got to play on them. You see, it became all these different things, and they had this fun skate session all together. And this is how it ended up in the gallery. You see the exhibition was about the School of Direct Experience. It was before it had started, and it was kind of this an example of a few different things that have led to it. But you see those chairs there, and the video that I just played was on that screen, so the kids could show up and be like, I'm in this exhibition. I also told them that if they're ever applied to art school, to say that they had a piece in the Audain Art Museum and they could use it on their CV. And then the following year, they asked us to come back. They're like, oh, you like did this afternoon thing. Would you do one that's 5 days long? And so the dream of SODE is to have quite a creative infrastructure to make a workshop that feels like a place of celebration. We didn't have any of that yet. And so the idea was many of these projects you've seen were all made in a studio and brought to the streets. I was like, oh, I want to make the project in the public space with the people that are going to be using it. And so that's what we did. We taught the kids how to, most of them had never used any tools before, how to measure, basic carpentry skills. We had them build their own workstation. They made the sawhorses and the table, and we did a few of those. And then the ultimate goal was to build a creative collective workstation as a piece of art in the lawn there. So this is them making a jig to make stools. They each got to make their own stool and then welding the platform and the legs. They did, cutting of the metal. They were involved in every phase of it. And then with each of these projects we try to do, you have the kind of skill-based part where you're learning a skill to build, let's say, the stool legs. And then I like to at least have an element where they can add their own kind of creative expression into it. So they actually came up with patterns and upholstered their own stool tops, which was, incredible to see what they did. Emily was involved in kind of running that aspect of it, and I was stunned with what they all did in a very short period of time. Another aspect of it was to kind of create the infrastructure for the space. How do you make a space out of kind of simple lines? I collected all these me and my brother Ben collected all these old trampolines from people for free. You can get them anywhere for free, essentially. But they have a universal component that you can put together. So if you have a bunch of them, you could make something interesting. And so I essentially gave it to the kids and was like, what would you want to make? And they played around with it. And they made this quite fun kind of sculptural line that then ultimately they built these tables that linked the line together, and their stools were a part of it. So you had this more sculptural element that you could also activate as a workstation, and it had their stools. So yeah, you can see it here. It was left on the property for a number of weeks. I wish I got one of those stools. I didn't get to make one. Okay. Another idea is the collective creation as public performance. So doing it in a space where you know there's going to be lots of people around interests me. I was invited to do a workshop at the Tanween Festival. It's like it's a cultural center in Saudi Arabia. It was totally out of the blue and interesting series of things that led me there. Anyways, the brief was you have 2 days. We have this courtyard and there's a design conference, and we want you to teach the students a technical skill using a vacuum former, because that was one of the tools that they had and they hadn't really used it. And then we want them the second day to build something collectively as kind of a performance and involve people as they're passing between conference rooms and things like that. So we had this courtyard as a workspace. So I took that on and kind of explored the idea of tessellation as an idea where you could add kind of like a fingerprint. They made their own kind of, I arrived with these molded shapes that I knew would all fit together, and they were able to make clay models on them and vacuum form them, and kind of same as the stools, they each got to like try out a few different patterns, but I knew that they would all go together to then create what you'll see. I also came prepared with a number of my own kind of shapes to fill in the gaps, because I knew we wouldn't make enough. But it was a really powerful experience. They got just super into it. We had a vacuum former set up in the courtyard, and we're like pumping out molds, and then people were assembling them, and then the students were bringing other people in. And it was just, at least for me, it was a surreal place to be. And from what I heard from the students, they don't often in this context get the ability or opportunity to actually like work on stuff collectively. And so it was a unique opportunity for them as well. But yeah, the class was only a few hours long. They ended up staying for like into the night to kind of like make this thing happen. They all got super into it. These people on the right side actually weren't part of the group, and that was part of it too. Like, could the students learn a skill and then teach it to other people? And this is what we ended up with. Okay, this one's quick, but a key part of the School of Direct Experience is really just that everyone is welcome. I grew up in a large family, and I was never really treated as a kid. It was just sort of like you're on equal playing field with everybody, and that had a huge impact on me. And so I feel the same when I work with kids or I work with adults. And so I had this idea, could you do a barn raising with kids? It was just kind of like an image in my mind that I thought would be interesting. And so we did one at the Audain. There was also another 5-day workshop, but I essentially designed a series of components. And it was they were all labeled, but there was no instructions. And then they, as a group, had to figure out how to put it together. It was kind of like an icebreaker exercise where the kids really had to work together. We showed them how to use a drill and how to use a ratchet, but the rest of it they really had to figure out themselves by seeing what pieces fit. And then they kind of gained friendship through it. I think most of my best friends are people that I've worked on projects with, and you just gain kind of an interesting relationship that way. So this project was that. It was kind of like the icebreaker that then led into a whole other project, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't have time, but it was the first day. They assembled that whole thing in 3.5 hours, I think. And that's what it ended up being. I also drove it back to Vancouver like this. And they called it the Fire Fort, so that's where the name came from. Yeah, exactly. And those are the projects I'm going to show. Kind of what's next is continually designing kind of visions or ideas for other ways of making a roaming school. And this is kind of a version that I would hope to raise money for at some point. And it's this kind of vision of the ultimate like design build classroom that can show up in a community and have all the equipment needed to make pretty substantial projects. Studying at Emily Carr and U of T, great experiences, but they felt very insular. And I want to bring the tooling and stuff that exists in those kind of environments to more of a public-facing audience. And the dream is to actually build like public art and public spaces with the people that are going to be using that space, and to have the tooling and the expertise to help facilitate it in a meaningful way. And so this is the next step, hopefully. We'll see. Yeah.